Welcome to the Pump and Dump channel. Today I'd like to talk about this company called Hoegh LNG Holdings. It is a Norwegian company listed on the Oslo Exchange. There is also a Hoegh LNG Partners LP, however that is a separate entity which is owned by just under 50% by Hoegh LNG Holdings. Their main business is in the LNG space. They own for the most part several of these big ships here which are called FSRUs, that stands for Floating Storage Regasification Units. They also own a few LNG carriers, however their main business is centered around these FSRUs. The way these ships work is they are chartered out to another company and then they are just redeployed from the location they are currently at to serve their charter, and usually they just anchor offshore and then they just sit in place. They take on LNG from carriers on board, store it, and then slowly regasify it and funnel it into the grid where it is to be used as a source for generating electricity. Going to the annual report, we can go straight to the market outlook to get a macro view of what's happening in the sector. Here they mentioned that LNG trade grew by almost 10% in 2018 as compared to 2017. However, they also mentioned that LNG imports through FSRUs fell by 6%. So the question is, why are the assets that they own in less demand whilst the market is growing? We can find an anecdote in this paragraph as to what is happening. We can see here that Egypt Natural Gas Holdings decided to amend their contract they had for the Hoegh Gallant to be used as an FSRU, and they want to now use it going forward as an LNG carrier until the charter expires. Fortunately for Hoegh LNG, the company here, the counterparty, is honoring the contract it signed for to use the Hoegh Gallant as an FSRU, and therefore they're going to compensate them for the rate difference between the two. Unfortunately, we can see here also that the charter was set to expire in April 2020, which is in 7 months' time, and at that point in time there will be a question as to whether Hoegh LNG Holdings will be able to find a new location to redeploy this FSRU going forward to be used as an FSRU, or whether they will opt to leave it on a LNG carrier contract in the short term until they can find a new employment as FSRU. So the problem with this is, of course, that in the case that they don't find a new opportunity to use it as an FSRU, the market will mark down the value of the asset to be valued as an LNG carrier would. The difference, of course, between the two is capital costs for FSRUs are about twice as much as for LNG carriers, and also the day rates on FSRUs are 2 to 1.5 times higher than for LNG carriers. So going into the history about where FSRUs came from, why they were first built in the first place. The first FSRU was actually an LNG carrier which was converted by adding the regasification units, and the experiment worked. And thinking back 20-30 years ago, there was not such a big market in LNG because natural gas historically was more expensive. And in the wake of fracking, there was of course this flood of new and low cost natural gas to be turned into low cost LNG. And when the fracking revolution set in, something like a decade ago, there was the decision made by many locations where FSRUs were used on more of, let's say, an opportunistic basis. They made the decision to build terminals that would be there permanently. And once these terminals were decided to be built, of course, there were long lead times for them to get constructed. And this is kind of also now going into the advantages of FSRUs versus terminals and vice versa on both the economics and on the logistics. So going over here to this report by Wärtsilä in 2018, they mention that the day rate for FSRUs in 2018 was 80 to 100,000 US dollars per day. The regasification service is mentioned as being 15 to 25,000 dollars per day, and we can see this in the chart here. It's exemplified, and they contrast that to land-based terminals where we see the regasification costs being listed as 100,000 US dollars per day. So in contrast, it looks more expensive, but we can see here that they've chosen the upper bounds of this range that they've given if we assume 80,000 as the lower range and 15,000 here, we would get a cost competitive overall solution for the FSRUs that could compete with the processing costs for onshore terminals. What we can see, of course, here is that the cost is mainly around the regasification, the processing cost, when we're looking at the land-based solution, and the regasification service on FSRUs is priced pretty cheaply. However, we have to of course look at the daily charter, and if we take an FSRU and split it into the two components, the floating storage and the regasification unit, we can imply that the regasification service is, of course, it looks cheaper on service, however, on the surface, but the reality is that when you are chartering this ship, you have to pay the charter on a daily basis, and this charter, we could say that that would be the cost for storing LNG inside the ship offshore floating in the sea. On the land-based terminal solution, we do not have such high costs for storing. You build the storage unit and then you fill it up, and there's very low maintenance on those big storage units. So we could imply that the storage costs on shore are very low, close to nothing, let's say, and therefore we can say that these two solutions for storing and regasifying LNG are kind of similar in terms of the economics. However, if we think about the economics, we also have to look at the logistics and what are the logistical advantages of FSRUs. The main advantage is that it can be redeployed, so the owner has that flexibility in being able to send it from one location to another in case charter rates are higher, or at least the offering rates are higher in one geographic location than in another. However, from the client side, that's of course presenting some risks. If one country decides they want a permanent terminal to store and regasify LNG, then the land-based solution is the best, because that will be there permanently. And in terms of the logistics, of course, we need to think about what is going to happen in case we have an FSRU and a terminal in the same location, and there is no LNG coming in because of a blockade, and let's say in the Strait of Hormuz. Let's say there is something similar to that, where some ships are not getting in or getting out, and the LNG does not arrive to the FSRU, then you're still paying the day rate for the FSRU for at least the charter. Even if you're not paying for the regasification service, you're still paying the full price for the charter, regardless of whether you're using it or not. But if you have a land-based solution where you have onshore storage, that costs you basically nothing, whether that's full or not. And if you just think about the regasification service being a cost when you are using the regasification service, in that situation where the LNG is not coming in, you would not have to pay that. So in terms of financial downside risk, a terminal is much less risky than an FSRU. Of course, the thing is, once you've chartered this FSRU, you have to use it constantly. You have to keep the unit working in terms of filling it up with LNG and then regasifying it non-stop. Otherwise, the economics don't work out, because, as I mentioned, you'll be paying a lot for storing LNG in a ship. So that's kind of the logistics and the economics to compare the two. From my point of view, terminals are a superior choice. Of course, there is the disadvantage that you cannot move a terminal from one country to another. Once it's built in a location, it can only operate there. But on the other side, if we think about it, we have that flexibility that we do not need to regasify the LNG on a consistent basis in case demand for natural gas drops. I also read the IGU World LNG report that kind of confirmed what I concluded from reading what's going on in the annual report of Hoegh LNG. It's a very lengthy report, very complete. There's also, in the 2018 edition, there's this nice chart here that shows the regasification costs based on project start dates from 2006 to 2017, where we can see that even though the onshore terminals cost has gone up, and FSRUs has stayed consistent, we can still say that the rising cost is not going to create a shift from the terminals back to the FSRUs, because once these terminals are built, you have to use them. There is no point in having a terminal where you have a regasification unit and storage and you leave that lying idle because you think that in terms of operating costs the FSRU is superior. You have to always think about using the assets that you have, and if you're not using them, you're still losing money. So overall, my conclusion about Hoegh LNG, it's trading around 33 Norwegian crowns at the moment. It has been trading between 31 and 35, I'd say, for the last few weeks. It's in a downward trend in a small tight channel. As I mentioned, the main risk is this what's going to happen with this contract here. I think that overall the time for FSRUs has passed, because we've gone from a smaller LNG market that would benefit these FSRUs, which were flexible and could be moved around, to an established market with fracking coming to the front and increasing the availability of natural gas. So in the long term, I would think that the demand for FSRUs is not going to grow that significantly. The main risk is, of course, whether these FSRUs will be used as FSRUs in the future. If they do not get used as FSRUs and turn more and more to LNG carriers, there is that risk that there will be impairments to the asset values. And for the most part, Hoegh LNG, like most shipping companies, use a lot of debt when they're financing these assets. So the risk to equity holders is quite significant in this company. I think it's a very well run company, but I think the market is not favorable towards the assets that they own. So in the long term, I would expect this to deteriorate a bit more from where it is now. So in my opinion, it's not necessarily a good buy at this point in time. If the share price came down and would reflect a high usage of LNG carriers once these FSRUs come off contract, and the company is still solvent, then you could buy it. But I think that apart from some spikes in day rates when FSRU demand would be higher during a small period of time, there is no real reason to hold this long term. I don't think it's a good investment. And just remember that the intrinsic values of these companies, they change over time. There is nothing to say that in a year's time from now that the assessment that I would come up with would change. Of course, intrinsic value, as I said, changes over time as news develops and markets develop. Always keep that in mind. Something that is a buy one day can be a sell another. And yeah, that's basically all I have to say. Remember, this is just a provision of information and opinion. It's not recommendation to buy or sell anything. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment if you agree or disagree with my assessment. I wish you a good day.